All right, let's try this again. Try rebooting PowerPoint. Keep Task Manager open just in case. Is it that I had 7 PowerPoints open? I don't know. Who knows anymore? Okay. Not that one. Not that one. That one. I don't know what that one even is. Let's close it. Okay. Sorry about that. Oops. My laptop is deciding to have a fit today. Okay. Right. So open questions, the advantages. You might get unprompted knowledge is the big one. You might learn things you didn't think about. You can use them, especially in pilot projects to build different kinds of questions. Disadvantage, more time consuming. You have to code them. You have to transcribe them. People may not like them as much because they're hard to answer. You have to type in an answer or say an answer. And there can be some variability between people who are doing your, who are giving your survey. Advantages, right? Closed questions. The advantages, I know I had this one because I made a Liam Neeson joke. They minimize differences between interviewers, right? Intra-interviewer or inter-interviewer variability. They make it easier to understand a question because the answer is provided, right? So even sometimes if your wording is not perfectly clear, people can figure out what you're talking about from how you phrased it, or the answers rather. And closed questions can be answered quickly, right? Which means you have less problems with people quitting your survey. Okay, so when we talk about errors in survey research, and this happens all the time, right? This is why you almost all, when I did the couple of surveys that I've run at a citywide level, I spent a huge amount of time with my one friend, Dorothy, who basically has a PhD in evaluations and writes survey questions for a living, or at least part of her living. And we just worked through all of the questions and kind of figured out what questions of mine worked and what didn't work, right? So poorly worded questions, is one. If you've worded something confusingly or jargony, right? One of the things you have to keep in mind when you're writing any kind of research question is that you almost always have to break it down into the terms, into the simplest terms possible, right? What is the least complicated way you can ask the question so most people will understand, right? So I was doing a survey for a bunch of Catholic organizations in the city on contract, and they wanted to know, whether the people in Edmonton, what they felt about the tenets of Catholic social teaching. And when I went into documents for Catholic social teaching, it's all full of Catholic-y jargon, right? This way that Catholics talk to each other that nobody else was going to understand. So one of the things that Dorothy and I did is we sort of broke all of those statements down into basic it was it is the duty of all mankind to care for creation and all which God has granted it. And it was basically we were how much do you agree that it is important to care for the environment, right? That was the sort of the essence of it, but we got rid of all the jargon. Weirdly, Albertans cared, of all the things in Catholic social teaching, they cared the least about the environment. I thought it was going to be the poor, but it was the environment. So that was odd. Our Edmontonians was and atheists especially, it was weird. It was the opposite of what I thought. Atheists, it was only 60% of them said they cared about taking care of the environment. I'm intriguing. I don't know why that was, but it was interesting. Okay, so that's poorly worded questions or jargony questions, right? So you want to make sure that doesn't happen as much as possible. Interviewer error in asking questions, right? So if you're doing essentially what amounts to a structured interview or a phone interview, right? If your interviewer reads the question incorrectly, that can be a problem. Misunderstanding on the part of the employees is employees. My brain. Interviewees. It's a lot harder to correct for because, even if you're doing an in-person, a structured interview, it's really hard to know whether the person has understood has understood the question the way you're asking it. So they can misunderstand or think you mean something else, or sometimes they have an ideological or personal or religious or other kind of bias that might, theoretically shift them in their way of thinking. Okay. Lapses in memory, and this one, when we get to like errors to avoid in writing survey questions, people may not remember stuff, right? Human memory has a bunch of flaws. It's not particularly good at remembering certain things, and so there can be a lot of problems with memory. And the more specific the more specifically you ask things like, how many times in the last year have you been to McDonald's, right? I have no idea. It's not that many probably, but if you ask me to put like a number quantity on it, I would have no idea, right? Lapses in memory, people may not know, like how many times did you exercise at a gym in 2019 prior to pandemic? No idea. Actually, probably the answer is closer to 0 for me, but we won't delve into that. So, right, lapses in memory can be a problem, and especially the more specific information you are asking for, the more difficult it is for people to remember, so they may simply not remember things. Really important, something to think about if you're interested in studying like people's feelings or subjective states using using survey research. It's really hard to ask a person how they felt more than like a couple of weeks in the past, right? Because people just forget, and so they tend to write in how they feel now compared to how they felt then. So it's often quite inaccurate, because like if you ask me like, how depressed were you in 2019 prior to the pandemic, I don't really remember, right? I could give you a kind of a guess, but it's you're stretching memory beyond what makes sense. Okay. Interviewer error in recording information. Again, if you're doing like a structured interview where you're asking the questions and filling it out, or a phone interview, right, where or a phone survey where you're filling it, the person asking the question is also filling it out. Sometimes people get it wrong. You enter a 1 instead of a 10. You forget to hit the 0. So that can be a bit of an issue. It's entering it into a computer. And biases related to the characteristics of gender of the interviewer or interviewees, right? Race, gender, politics, all of these things can create biases that you can't really control for. Okay. Yeah, I mean, closed questions, they're really useful because in offering people responses, you get a lot of consistency and it's very easy to work with. You do lose that spontaneity and authenticity though, right? And the ability to learn new things you didn't know, right? You're asking questions kind of about things you think are important already. Respondents might have different interpretations of wordings for fixed responses, right? Even in Likert scales, right? What's the meaning of strongly agree or strongly disagree? How strongly do you have to feel? Like, what's the boundary for you between answering, just disagree or agree instead of strongly? It can be very different for different people, and so there's some play in the system, right? They might not find one that applies to them, and there's problems with giving, don't know as a possible answer as well, and lots of people caution against it. Okay. So, what kind of questions can you ask? Typically personal factual questions, right? So these are most typical of demographic or other kind of lifestyle questions, right? So age, occupation, number of cars owned, number of children, age of children, income, right? These are all things that you can ask in terms of personal factual questions. Race, religion that they identify with, it's all that kind of stuff. Factual questions about others, right? So you can ask them, a factual question like, say about, the most typical factual questions would be about, say, politicians. What do they know about, Justin Trudeau's most recent policy? Those can be a little bit problematic because a lot of people are just not going to know. People might have limited knowledge, right? Or things like environmental issues. people might not have a ton of knowledge about them. So you can have whole categories of questions in your survey that you're assuming people understand, and they might just not know anything, right? Questions about perceptions of others are really useful, and you see that right in political polling. That's the bulk of political polling, is questions like, how do you perceive, Justin Trudeau or Pierre Poilievre or Donald Trump or Joe Biden, right? How do you, what's your perceptions of them? How much do you like them? How much do you agree with their policies? These, how do you think they would make a good leader? These are all questions that you can ask about other people. But asking people about, other people or things they don't know about can be, problematic. Same thing with if you ask factual questions about like a political demonstration, say about something like January 6th, or the trucker convoy. Was it convoy? Trucker convoy? I should probably know that. People might not have a lot of knowledge, and one of the things that happens a lot is people are, you might think that events, everybody remembers events because they're important to you, but a lot of times people are just not paying attention to things, right? And people don't remember systematically, they remember partially. So asking these types of questions, you can do it, but it can be a little problematic. Questions about attitudes, right? Do you think this is a good policy, right? Do you think, the Canadian, rate on a scale of agreement? I think that the Canadian child tax benefit is a useful benefit for Canadians, right? That's not a well-worded question, right? And then you got strongly agree to strongly disagree. Questions about kind of attitudes, how do they feel about something, a politician, a policy, City Hall, roads in Edmonton, anything you want, right? Whether they should build a new hockey rink in Calgary. These are all attitudes that you can ask, and they're really, really common in public opinion polling. Because, a lot of times we want to know how people feel about things, and you have clients that want to know how people feel about things. Really common too, if you go into marketing, right? In marketing, you see a ton of these kinds of questions in marketing surveys, because again, people want to know, how do you feel about Nike as a brand? Or what do you think Nike is an environmentally responsible company? Do you think that, Nike is involved in greenwashing, right? Attitudes are these sorts of things. Questions about beliefs, right? Political beliefs, or any other kind of belief. Say about the existence of God, if you're talking about religion, is a useful one. And then, questions about knowledge. You can ask, to test people's knowledge, right? Who is the first Prime Minister of Canada, or something like that. Okay. So, when you're designing questions, what do you need to do? You need to keep your research question in mind, right? One of the things that you, obviously for this class, you have a limited number, because I'm giving you a small number of questions to write, right? It's 5 for the mini lab, and then maximum of 15 for the major lab. So you have a limit. If you go out in the world, right, and you're piloting surveys, you're sending out surveys, there's an outside limit to how long of a survey people are going to, how many questions people are going to answer, right? Before they get tired and frustrated and hang up the phone or exit the browser, or even if you're in person, if they're I think I'm done, I'm out of here. And so keeping the research question in mind, does this answer something that's critical to my research question? The other thing you might want to keep in mind, now if you end up going out in the field and doing this kind of work, is that most times now people are doing this online, and you have to buy, basically your time on an online platform. And one of the real tricks is that often these platforms charge by the number of questions, right? So minimizing the number of questions minimizes your cost, and especially if you're funding this out of a research grant or out of your own pocket, right? That can be really important. So keep the research question in mind and formulate don't go far afield if you don't have to. Make sure your questions are all answering something pertinent to your research question, right? Focus on exactly what you want to know, right? So, be really specific, right? If you want to know about people's income, don't ask just what is your income, right? Ask them what is your income from all sources of revenue, either before or after taxes. Before taxes is probably easier in this case, because if you ask me how much I make after taxes, I have absolutely no idea. But I know what my salary is, right? If you want to know standard of living, you could ask how many children are living at home, how many children do they have, right? How long do they spend commuting, right? What's their level of life satisfaction? You can ask a bunch of questions about this. So, be specific and make sure that you're not throwing out metrics that are just a waste of time, right? So what do you want to know, and what kind of question is going to get you that knowledge? And I'll talk about existing question sets a little bit later, but they're really, really useful. And I think one of the most important things you can do is really do your own survey and think about how you would answer the question, right? Are you able to answer your own question? Or give it to someone who's a non-specialist and have them do your survey. Because they might look at the question and be like, I have no idea how to answer it. So how would you answer this question? Are you able to answer the question? Is the average person able to answer the question? Put yourself in the position of the respondent, right? You might think it's really interesting, but if you can't think of how you would answer, there's a good chance your respondent's not going to know either. Okay. So, there's a bunch of avoids, and then I have a few examples to look at, and you can tell me what you think is either right or wrong with them. Okay, so avoid ambiguous terms, right? Even terms that get commonly bandied about, people might be confused by it, and then if they're confused, you're going to get results that are all over the place. I mentioned income, right, a second ago. Income, like I said, I would always say all sources of revenue, because I think that all the money you make in a year, that's probably what you want to talk about, and it includes everything, right? But let's say someone works in the service industry, just do tips count, right? Or is it just salary? Okay. Investment income, right? Any money they make off of investments, whatever other, I don't know, other sources of income, right? People can misinterpret the term income, so you have to be really, really specific. Wealth is another one that's really difficult, because what does wealth entail, right? It's a fairly ambiguous term. So if you wanted to use it in a survey, right, make sure you define in very clear terms what you mean by wealth, right? So just make sure that, if you use a term that's kind of vague, you might have to explain it, right? Is it, with income, is it before tax or after tax? With wealth, does it include, just cash in the bank, or does it include value of assets as well, right? All of these things you have to kind of account for in doing it. Okay, this one, I think this is kind of partly true. I'm gonna say, take it with a grain of salt. Avoid really long questions. Sometimes you can't avoid it, right? Sometimes in order to get at what you're meaning and clarify things, you actually do have to put in fairly long questions, right? And if you remember from last class, I showed you some that I had used on a survey, and the text of the question was fairly long, but it's pretty straightforward to understand. So you can avoid overly long questions, right? Like paragraph long questions, or questions where you describe a historical event in great detail, right? Because people are going to get frustrated reading it or listening to it, or lose track of what the question is asking. So within limits, right? It doesn't mean that every question has to be one sentence, but just make sure that you're not asking these massively long questions, right? In 1492 or 1660, this happened, leading to this and this and this. What do you think about that? People are going to lose track of what you're asking. Okay, my favorite one probably is this one, and I always catch people on these, so do avoid it. The dreaded double-barreled question. So a double-barreled question is a question that's asking about two things, right? Meaning that the person who is encountering the double-barreled question may not know what it is that you're asking them, to answer, right? Because it might be like in the example of this question, was the course interesting and informative? Well, what if the question was, informative but not interesting? How would someone go about answering that question, right? It becomes really hard. How satisfied are you with the pay or working conditions? What if you're satisfied with the pay but not the working conditions, or vice versa, right? It becomes impossible to answer the question. And I will say, like, I've encountered on student assignments for this class at times not only a double-barreled question, not just a triple-barreled question, but last semester I encountered what is sort of the unicorn of questions, the quadruple-barreled question, where someone was asking in one question about 4 things. It was a thing of profound beauty. I showed it to my colleagues. I didn't tell them whose question it was, and we had a good discussion about how this is even possible. But it was quite the thing, right? So make sure your question is asking about one thing, because if there's 2 things and you're asking them to rate it like on an agreement scale, right? The course was interesting and informative. If it was informative but not interesting, how do you answer that? It can be really, really difficult. Okay. Really, really general questions. What do you think of the Prime Minister, right? Ask about specifics. What do you think about the Prime Minister's ethical standards, right? What do you think about the Prime Minister's hair? What do you think about his family situation? General questions, people aren't going to know what aspect of, say, you're asking about. Like, what do you think about the United States? Well, which part? What about the United States, right? Its political system, all of those things, right? So don't, general questions, you need to specify what it is you're interested in. And again, it should relate to your research question. Leading questions, right? You do not want leading questions. Questions that sort of suggest what the answer is, or tell, people maybe in not so unsubtle terms what they should think about it, right? Should the monarchy, which cost the taxpayers $5 million a year, be abolished, right? Or should the monarchy, which is an archaic institution, be abolished? Should the Catholic Church, which has been, implicated in the abuse of Indigenous students, lose its tax exempt status, right? All of these are sort of leading questions. Yeah, please.
So leading questions kind of be seen as like questions that are like making you feel a certain way.
Yeah. And it sort of implies what the questioner thinks the answer should be, right? And you want to let people say honestly, like you could ask that same question, like, should the monarchy be abolished, right? And then you're not telling people, that it's a terrible thing, right? Oh, it costs us $5 million. Because people maybe didn't know that it costs $5 million a year, right? And then they wouldn't maybe be inclined to say that it should be abolished, right? That sort of thing. Or like, should the Calgary Flames receive an arena which will cost the taxpayers $350 million, right? Or I don't know how much it is, right? Immediately you're kind of structuring the question in such a way as to push people towards a certain answer. And you should let people answer honestly by excluding all of that kind of stuff. Okay, does that all make sense? Sorry, I'm going fast. Already a half hour has gone by, but I feel like I'm going fast. Okay, and avoid questions that are actually 2 questions. On a scale of 1 to 5, how much do you like Stephen King novels? You're sort of assuming that in that case that people read Stephen King novels, right? What if someone has never read a Stephen King novel? How would they answer this question, right? So the first one is like a screening question. Do you read Stephen King novels? Right? To find out if they actually read Stephen King novels. And then, on a scale of 1 to 5, how much do you like Stephen King novels, right? Then you can ask as a follow-up question, and then if they don't read Stephen King novels, you skip it, right? If people don't shop at Superstore, right? Asking them, on a scale of 1 to 5, how would you rate the shopping experience at Superstore? Well, if someone doesn't shop at Superstore, they can't answer the question, right? So again, you want to make strongly agree to strongly disagree, and then have another question. I do not believe in any higher power, right? Or I am religious, strongly agree. I consider myself religious. And then, you know, I only consider myself spiritual, which is kind of a negation of that, right? So just, you can use negatives, just use them really, really carefully. The double negative can be a little bit confusing in a case like that. Yeah, minimize technical terms, right? Like I said, jargon is the enemy of good surveys. If you have technical terms, you need to essentially kind of whittle them down to, right? You know, if you want to know about people's experiences of the University of Alberta, did you attend the University of Alberta, right? Is a good place to start. Okay. Okay, these are slightly technical, but useful nonetheless. Yeah, so you need to ensure symmetry between closed answer questions and their responses, right? Here the example is, how satisfied are you with your life in general? You know, obviously a good scale here would be completely satisfied to completely dissatisfied, or very satisfied to very dissatisfied. The way this is phrased, right? Very good, good, middling, poor, very poor. There's you know, it doesn't really fit. How satisfied are you? I'm satisfied good, right? So there can be an imbalance. Just make sure the wording kind of fits. And I'll show an example of another one that didn't fit in a second. So yeah, you need to make sure that the scale matches the question, right? And ensure that answers are balanced. In a way, like unbalanced scales can be a way of loading the answers to achieve a particular result as well, right? Overall, the quality of instruction in the course was excellent, very good, good, satisfactory, or poor, right? You have, you know, basically 1, 2, 3, 4 kind of positive options and 1 negative option. So anyone who felt negatively, like anyone who felt, you know, that they didn't like the instruction in the course, is going to go to poor. So you could be skewing it in a negative direction potentially, or because, you know, you're going to say maybe in your reporting, you know, 90% of respondents said, you know, the instruction of the course was excellent to satisfactory, right? These are all positive things. And then, but you're kind of excluding the fact that you didn't give people a lot of nuance in terms of the negative options. So just make sure those scales are kind of balanced. Yeah, Joan.
What's wrong with the first one?
How satisfied are you with your life in general? I'm good satisfied with my life in general.
Oh, is it like the wording?
It's the wording, right? Like, is my satisfaction very good? No, you're like, you would be, you know, very satisfied, right? It's that, you know, good and satisfied don't quite go together. It's a little bit off. So there's a little bit of a disjunct between them. It's not the worst I've seen. I'll show you that in a minute. Yeah, please.
How do you measure, like, the difference between very good and good? I feel like there's a flaw.
Like between very good and good in this?
Yeah, like even when you ask it for like a very like minute question, like it's, oh, I like cats. Like,
right.
How much do you like cats? Do you love cats? Do you like cats very good? Like, are you like kind of like? I'm just,
I mean, it's up to the person taking it to sort of determine where, and this is again where some of the problem with a closed question is that people's scales may, like, you know, yeah, how much do you love cats? You know, completely, somewhat, you know, neutral, somewhat dislike, or how much you like cats. You know, like them a lot, like them somewhat, neither like nor dislike, somewhat dislike and dislike. You know, everybody's going to put that scale a little bit differently. You're trying to get sort of, you know, a sense of intensity, I guess. Like if people really hate cats, they're going to put at, you know, dislike a great deal, right? But it's really up to the person interpreting it, which is where some of the, you know, the shakiness comes in this kind of way of asking questions. There's no way to guarantee how a person interprets your response options, right? The more consistent you are with them though, like, you know, if you're changing response options numerous times during a survey, it can lead to more of this variance. Whereas if you stay with, you know, a consistent scale throughout a large part of the survey, then people will kind of fall into a pattern and everything's going to kind of even out a little bit more. But the more times you change it, yeah, the more times people are going to have to rethink about it. And then I dislike cats very good, right? So Sorry, bad joke. Okay, does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay. Yeah, don't overstretch people's memories, right? And again, part of this I think is like consider how you would answer some of the questions that you're asking, and whether you can remember, right? Like if you're asking like how many times people ate fruit in the last month, right? That's really difficult for people to remember, right? If you ask them how often they attend religious services, that's a lot easier to remember. It's less frequent, for example, and it tends to be really important to people. So you have to make sure that what you're asking of people is something that they can actually remember, right? And like even things like, you know, how satisfied were you with your life in 2014, right? I don't know, right? I'm like, I think I was pretty satisfied, but I could be remembering it wrong, right? Like things like personal emotional states are really difficult to remember, unless something was like cataclysmic or, you know, very punctuated, right? You hit rock bottom in 2014. But for the average person, it's going to be like, I guess kind of okay. Everything seemed fine. I don't remember. I literally don't remember 2014 at all if you ask me how I felt, right? If you told me some events that were happening in 2014, maybe I would know, and I have a general sense. So yeah, you need to make sure that what you're asking is something people can actually remember. You know, if you can remember what you've eaten for the last 3 weeks, every single meal, then you're an exceptional person. Most people can't remember how often they exercised. Most people can't remember. Yeah, subjective emotional states. Most people can't remember. You know, so make sure, again, if you're going to ask about the past, it needs to be fairly objective things that people are going to remember pretty distinctly. You know, I don't know, when was your first, when did you first become sexually active? You know, could be one people tend to remember. Yeah, please.
For like questions like that, like I've seen it a lot in surveys where they say like, how often do you eat fast food? And it's like 1 to 5 times a month, and then like 10 to 20 times a month, or like whatever, right? They're broken down into like numerical categories. Like, is that a thing?
So I tend to think that's a bad question.
Just a bad question.
Like, because I would be like, I would say, how often have you eaten fast food in the last month? Probably okay. But if you're asking me how often do I eat it in general, I have no idea, right? And like, was November different from August, right? I happened to be traveling in August to the United States, so I ate a lot of fast food because we were driving. How do I even, you know, like, I think it's a bad question. I do know what you mean though. It's like, how often do you shop at these kinds of retailers? And it's like, I don't know, right? Like sometimes
they
more.
break it down so it's like a quantity. Like, are you in this range where you eat a little bit versus a lot of it, right? Is sort of like easier to put yourself there because you're like, well, maybe I grabbed, like, you don't have to remember the exact number.
Yeah.
Like,
So
maybe I had a burger, but like I definitely didn't have 20. You know?
Sure. Yeah, you could do that. I tend to think like often, like to or very often to like never would be a scale that's more reasonable. Like
But
how
that still feels like very subjective.
it is very subjective, right? And that's the problem. And if you have like a specific time frame in mind, and the more recent the time frame is, the better your survey is going to be, right? Because it's like how often in the last month. I can probably, even then, I'm like, I can only sort of remember, right? I guess the average thing, they're asking you to try and average it out to get around some of that memory problem, like, but it's kind of it's a rough question for that reason, right? Like, because I'm like, I would say probably, for me, I'm like, seldom, but then again, right, it depends on the kind of time I'm having. So I'm like, maybe sometimes it's often, and I don't know how to answer the question. So I would tend to think they're bad questions. They're very marketing questions. And one of the things you might notice, if you do any amount of this, is that marketing people ask really stupid questions. I don't want to say that universally, but often they're very agenda driven. So they're asking for a very particular reason, which means that in order to get that information, they have to ask a question that's kind of dumb and not well worded. And I'm being judgmental, but I've done a lot of marketing surveys, and they can be frustrating from a question composition point of view, because it's just like, I don't know how to answer your question, and I don't know that you know how to answer your question, but at the same time, I understand why they're asking it, because their boss wants like a population profile. How often do people eat fast food, right? Even though it has some flaws in the tool. Sorry, that was a long answer. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Do you have other questions?
No.
Okay. Did you write marketing questions like that and I just said bad things about you?
No.
Okay, perfect. I didn't want to make you feel bad.
No, I was just trying to quantify if it's like an avoid always or like use conditionally kind of situation, and I think you sort of established avoid.
I would say avoid is better because it's just, because especially if I don't know how to answer the question and you don't know how to answer the question, right? Then
Like for me, it doesn't feel like a difficult question to answer. Like I would be like, I probably don't eat it more than once a week, if that, and so I would put myself in like the lower category, right? Like I don't have to know the exact number, but it doesn't feel like difficult to me to kind of like guess where I fall.
yeah, maybe it's just like like if you're asking on average, like what time period are you just asking like in general? I feel like it's not a great question, but then it would be worse if you're like how often in a year or how often in a month, right? Because then it gets really difficult to quantify it if you can't remember. But again, if you put in I think a time frame, like how often in the last week did you eat fast food? I'm like, oh, that's easy. I can figure that out. Month, a little harder, but I can probably figure it out too. General questions, I don't love as much, but they're probably not the worst. Sorry, you're good?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Don't know. The textbook says, and there's considerable variance in the literature as to whether you should use a don't know option, which is also the same with prefer not to answer. Whether you should have these options. And they sometimes, so like the textbook says, don't know, carefully consider don't know options, should be avoided if possible. All over certain kinds of literature, I see don't know questions all over the place. And sometimes I wonder why people answer don't know. So you really have to think about it. Like you don't want to put in don't know, if you really need people to answer the question to get the data. But also, if it's something that people should know, you shouldn't put don't know, right? Like on this kind of fast food question, you could put a don't know, like how often on average do you eat fast food? You could put don't know. The risk comes that a lot of people might be like, I don't really know, and just answer that. And you might get a lot of people in don't know. I've seen it sometimes with people are like, how often do you attend religious services? And they have a don't know category. And I'm never entirely clear why, because it's like, what do you mean you don't know how often you go? Like, you should have some idea, but that might be a futzy thing for me. Yeah, please.
What does don't know do for like when you're like
Doing analysis?
like what does it do for the overall research?
It's basically a kind of garbage answer, to be honest. It's like, because you don't know why people don't know, you can't really do much analysis on it. It's like, yeah, especially if you feel like people should know. Like in cases I've seen it, I always find that it's like, well, what do you mean you don't know, right? I don't understand what's inside that category. And it's sometimes used in those, I don't know. I've seen this on like research where people are looking into people's pornography use, right? Especially, and you put a don't know in there, and don't know jumps up to like 25%. Because there's that social desirability bias. People just don't want to answer, right? But do they know how often they, access internet pornography? Probably. But so it can end up being, a place where social desirability bias ends up. People don't want to answer your question because it makes them uncomfortable. So they go into don't know. Yeah, I mean, so when people put it in because they don't want to force people to answer a question, right? If you have like a forced response question on a survey, so this is mostly true on like online where people can't skip questions. People sometimes put don't know to give people like an exit valve. Other people put prefer not to answer, which again, you just throw that throw that out. But yeah, it sort of muddies the waters. Like, why do people not know, especially if the question is pretty clear? It can be used though, and often, like, if you're using it in filtering questions, right? And this is a good place to use it, I think. In filtering questions, so you want to make sure you're getting the right population, right? Are you Catholic? If someone answers don't know, you just boot them out of the sample, right? Because if they don't know, you don't know, right? Do you ever eat at fast food restaurants? If people don't know, then they're probably not going to be able to answer the rest of your survey either, right? So they're used, I think, carefully, and I think in some cases, say maybe you're asking about political questions, right? Specific policies of the government. Don't know can be really useful in that circumstance, because what if people actually don't know, right? It's like, what do you think of the Canadian child care benefit? And people don't have any knowledge about it. That's actually kind of a useful measure, because you're like, oh, maybe the government isn't doing a good job of communicating the benefits of that, right? So in that case, I think it makes sense. In cases where people should know, I don't. Marketing stuff, right? If a particular marketing campaign, right? You're asking people's opinions about a particular marketing campaign, and they just maybe didn't see it, don't know can be useful, because then you're like, ooh, 75% of people answered don't know on this question. Well, that means our campaign didn't get very good penetration, right? So they can be useful in that way. If it's like an escape valve for people, you might want to put prefer not to answer as a better escape valve than don't know, right? That would be just kind of if I was designing it. I know my friend and I had a big discussion about this, because I had don't knows and prefer not to answers, and she would challenge me on it every time. She's like, shouldn't they know this, right? Shouldn't they know how often they volunteer? Shouldn't they know how often they give money to this charity, right? If you're adding don't know as an escape valve, maybe it's better to prefer not to answer, right? And then again, there might be reasons to like take that person out of the sample in general. Yeah.
So then, say if like a lot of people were to say don't know or prefer not to answer, would that question say 80% of people said I don't know, would that question not really be valid for some of the answers you are getting?
I think it would. Yeah, I mean, it might be like a badly worded. I mean, it could indicate a badly worded question, right? Like potentially, it could indicate that. It could also indicate, like, if you're asking about awareness or knowledge about something, that there's low levels of awareness. So I guess it's situational in that case. So you'd have to look at that question and see why you think you got that much on it. Or are you in a social desirability kind of, people for whatever reason don't attend religious services, but they're having trouble admitting it to themselves, so they're answering don't know, right? You have, on a case by case, you kind of have to be like, why is that answer there? And yeah, in some cases, that's why you don't want to put it there, because giving people that escape valve means they're not having to make a choice on your scale, right? Sorry, does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, cool. All right, it's now been 51 minutes. Okay. Yeah, so question order, generally speaking, question order should be fixed, right? Everybody should get the same questions in the same order, unless you're testing for order effects, right? And order effects is if you ask questions in a particular way, does that change the way people answer, right? So if you asked about like a political policy, then asked about their opinion of Justin Trudeau, rather than asking about their position on, or their opinion of Justin Trudeau before, if you want to see how that kind of affects people, you could ultimately, change the question order for different people. And essentially then you're running an experiment, right? You're sort of running a survey-based experiment to see, whether asking about, Justin Trudeau's taxpayer-paid trip to Jamaica for Christmas affects people's opinions of him, or vice versa. So, but mostly speaking, right, you want the order to be consistent so that you're not seeing any kind of effect, like order effects, right? So that you're not seeing any shift. Everybody's getting the same test so that everybody, kind of reacts in the same way. Yeah, typically you ask your, early questions are related to the announced research topic, right? So you ask your most pertinent questions first. And typically, you ask the questions that are the least relevant last, right? And typically the easiest to answer. So almost all surveys that you'll see, will end with demographic questions, which are sort of the least relevant to specific areas of interest. And start with like, you know, what do you think of this campaign? Or, you know, your opinion of, you know, this, that, the other thing. University of Alberta's recent cuts, or whatever it happens to be, right? You want to ask those questions up top. Yeah, the questions that your respondent are going to be interested in should be asked as early in the interview as possible, to really, and it helps to draw them in, right? It helps to make them feel useful. If you're asking a bunch of really irrelevant questions at the beginning, people are more likely to get frustrated. So keep, you know, a lot of your really relevant stuff at the top. Sensitive questions, you know, have you ever been the victim of a sexual assault? Like if you were doing like a victimization survey, let's say a questionnaire or a survey that has a victimization aspect to it, like have you ever been the victim of a crime or a sexual assault, right? You should probably put it somewhere kind of middle to last quarter, but not right at the end, right? You don't want these questions to be where you leave people off because they're likely to feel much more upset, right? If you left it right to the end. So kind of like, if there's a really controversial question, chunk it in the middle. Yeah.
Yeah, why did it have to be like well into schedule? Why not like more on?
You're more likely to. So okay, this is a little bit of a psychological thing.
Okay.
If let's say you ask that as the first question, right, or the third question. What's that? Sorry.
I'm not thinking of first. I'm thinking of like.
Let's say like in the top quarter. It's a tough question, right? So people haven't invested much in your survey, even in terms of time, right? So if I bump into a really controversial question like question 4, bang. I'm more likely then to quit, right? Because I'm like, man, this survey is rough. If I've invested, let's say, you know, it's a 20-minute survey and I'm in minute 16, right? I know the survey is almost over. I have this really tough or sensitive question, but I've already put 16 minutes into this. You're much more likely to hang in there knowing you're kind of close to the end and just answer the question than be like, this puts me off so much. It's a psychological investment thing, right? It's like,
What's the sunk cost fallacy?
People have the sunk cost fallacy, right? That they already have put this much in, so why stop here? And you kind of want to use that to your advantage. So you still get people to answer those controversial questions or sensitive questions. Because yeah, otherwise, like if you ask it too upfront, they may just quit, right? Now again, if you potentially, if all of your questions are sensitive, like you're doing a questionnaire or survey that has to do with sexual assault, there might not be a way to avoid that, right? You can't, kind of massage your way into that, but you still want to make sure that, in general, right? All of these are general principles. If you put it kind of, below the halfway mark, people have already put so much in, they're less likely to jump out. And your goal is to get data and to get people to complete your survey. And so you can resort to minor forms of psychological trickery to achieve your ends. As long as it's not like open manipulation, where it's like, if you answer one more question, you get a cookie, or, you get a chance at winning a prize. You don't want to do that. But, if they're already invested and you can kind of get it there, they're less likely to jump out or get offended or hang up on you or whatever it happens to be. Make sense? Okay. Yes, okay. Yeah, avoid provoking a response set. Yes, response sets are bad because you have to. If you think something's a response set, you have to throw it away, right? Because you don't think the person is answering honestly. And I don't recommend doing what the psych survey that I took on the weekend suggested. It was like, did you answer this survey honestly? Should we use your data? It's a really weird way of asking whether the person did a response set. You really want to find this in statistics, right? So a response set exists if responses are motivated by something other than a person's actual feelings about an item, right? If they are bored, if they are just rushing through so they get their prize at the end, so they answer all the questions the same, right? Consumer satisfaction surveys are notorious for this, right? You know, you want a chance to win $1,000 in Walmart shopping, so you put in the code on your receipt and you just answer always, you know, completely satisfied on everything because you want to get through it as quickly as possible, right? Not your real feelings, but it's easier this way because if you put somewhat dissatisfied, a box opens and you then have to fill it out and you don't want any of that, right? So you do want to kind of make sure that you're not triggering response sets. Yeah, researchers using multiple item measures, including some that call for opposite positions. You know, and I talked about this, right? The kind of asking a question in a reversed way, right? You know, asking someone whether they attend religious services and then being like, rate your agreement with the statement, I rarely attend religious services, and make sure that you see that those two indicators kind of match, right? That can be a way of testing for response sets. You know, you see this all over in surveys once you know what you're looking for, is that people are you're like, didn't I answer this question once already? And you did, but they're checking to make sure you're still answering honestly, right? Because they're worried that people will just be like, tick, 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 to get through the survey, right? So opposite position, right, can be like, you know, I am likely to vote for the Liberal Party, strongly agree to strongly disagree. In the next election, right, the Conservatives would be my choice of political party, right? And if someone answered agree to both of those, you're probably looking at a response set, right? So, yeah, if people are just answering the same thing over and over, you may have to remove their answers from the survey, which again, it's not a problem if it's one case. If you get a lot of cases, right, suddenly your sample can go from, you know, 300 or 400 to 350, at which point you start to get into a situation, you know, where you're sort of below what you can use statistically. So if you start asking questions in unique ways, right, making sure that people are paying attention, often that'll just kind of shake people out of their largesse, and they'll answer it honestly for the most part. Okay. All right. I have some questions. These, you don't have these. You're gonna have to look up at the screen. Because I wrote them and I stuck them in here and I didn't give them to you. Because I want you to tell me what's wrong with this question, if there's anything wrong. So the question is, what upsets you most about Alberta's provincial government? Is it their policies, their ethics, their ideology, or the politicians? What, yeah, please.
It's all negative.
Okay.
They don't give you the option to say, like, I'm satisfied with Alberta's provincial government.
Okay, which would make it what?
The negatives.
It's like a loaded question.
It's a loaded question, right? Yeah.
Also thought it was a leading question.
It is, yeah, a leading or loaded question for sure. Yeah.
It's not like not like extensive enough.
Right. Yeah. It's definitely. I wrote this, you know, so there would be massive problems with it. This is me writing a terrible question for you to critique because it's fun. Okay. How about this one? How would you rate the features and adoption of the University of Alberta's new online learning software? They're replacing eClass with something better, I hope. Maybe. We'll see. Is there anything wrong with this question?
It's like a middle question.
Okay, in what sense?
It's asking about the features, but it's also asking about like adopting the software.
Okay.
They're kind of two different things.
Right, so how would you answer, right?
Like,
Yeah, I think in the back corner, yeah.
I don't know the name of the specific avoidance, but it's asking about the University of Alberta, and it has to apply to people who have only used the e-class, right?
Right.
So you're kind of like, say if you go to Nate or if you go to McEwen, they don't use e-class, so they wouldn't really be able to answer the question.
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of selecting your sample, it'd have to be part of U of A students as a population, right? Yeah, John.
It's slightly, I think we talked about it, like having it being two separate answers, two separate questions.
Right.
And also, it's kind of ambiguous a little bit.
Okay.
Yeah, how would you rate the feature adoption of like what, like all features are adopted, or like some of them, like what specific features?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. How would you fix it? How would you fix this question? Oh, sorry. Go. I didn't see you there.
That's okay. Just another one is that it isn't like specific enough. It's just new online learning software, like if you know, like the name of the program, otherwise people might go like, oh, are they talking about eClass, and then just answer according to like different.
Right. So have they picked which one they're using yet? Is it? I don't know. I think it's going to be D2L or Canvas. I don't know which one it is, or I would have put it in the. I would have put it in the question. Yeah.
Probably break it into 2 questions. Like whether it's like if you have used the new online software, how would you rate the features? And then it would be like how likely would you be to adopt the software?
Sure. Yeah. Or how was the university's adoption handled, or whatever. Right. Yeah. For sure. Splitting it into 2 questions. This one's a fairly easy one to split. Some of them that I find can be very challenging. Okay. How many times did you eat eggs in the last year? Yeah.
I don't know.
You don't know? Yeah, go ahead.
It also assumes that people ate eggs, like there's no 0 option.
Okay. Yeah. Nobody didn't eat eggs. Yeah.
That's what I was gonna say.
Okay. Yeah. So it's not, the response set is clearly not exhaustive in this case, right? Because what if you don't eat? What if you're allergic to eggs? There's no way for you to answer this question, right? Yeah.
I think most people eat like over 200 eggs a year, so like a year. So like most people would eat more than 300, more than like
More than
probably
30,
80 plus,
right.
More than 30, so more than like 30. But most people would probably be in the more than 30.
So the scales aren't exhaustive in the slightest, right? Yeah. Well, this is how many times did you eat eggs, right? Rather than how many eggs did you eat. So
I don't believe that.
yeah.
I think it's one of those questions that's kind of impossible to answer because it's like asking like, I don't remember what I had for breakfast last week sometimes.
Right.
Something like this.
And does an egg McMuffin from McDonald's count as eating an egg? I'm not even sure.
Eggs are also like used as an ingredient, so it can be like, did you eat eggs, like fried eggs for breakfast versus did you eat eggs in a cookie versus like, does the whatever else you eat contain eggs and all of that other stuff, which sort of like constitutes.
Right. So it's like income. It's way too vague. Like what counts as eating an egg, right? So how would you fix that? Like, I know the question is inherently too flawed to be repaired, and I did write it that way. But how would you fix that aspect of it?
I wouldn't, I scrapped it.
But if you were going to try and fix it, sorry?
You could probably ask like in general, how often do you incorporate eggs into your diet, and you can kind of give like
It kind of runs into the same problem, right? Like if I put it in cookies, is that incorporating eggs into my diet? I would probably say like, or did you want to take a crack at it, or are you leaning on your hand?
I have another idea.
Okay, go for it.
Okay, I think it's very general
Okay.
as well. Like I think like when you like look at the question as a whole, it's like, oh, how many eggs did you eat? And it's very like, well, you could eat eggs different ways. You can have them in baked goods, and you can have them, and it's very ambiguous, and it's very like random to me. It seems like it's hard to track how many eggs.
Of course. Yeah. I was actively trying to write bad questions, by the way. I mean, I would say like you could ask how many times you ate eggs as a main course in a meal, right? That would get away from how many times you put it in bread or cookies or something like that. I still agree. You probably should not use this question, but sorry. Hold on. Was there another hand? Oh, I don't know. Okay. Do you want to go on to another one? All right. Is there anything wrong with this one?
It's too biased towards positive. There's no like, it has 1, 2, 3, 4 positive and then 1 negative. There's no middle ground.
There's no middle ground, right? You're either satisfied, you're extremely to somewhat satisfied, or you're dissatisfied, right? There's no neutral, there's no somewhat dissatisfied. It's way too positive, right? You're gonna end up either with a whole ton of people here, or you're gonna be like, well, 95% were satisfied in some way, which, if you're wanting to bulk up the numbers of satisfied, you write a question like this. Otherwise, you don't. All right. What about this question? Have you ever been denied for a job opportunity or promotion because of your criminal conviction. I actually took this from a student assignment from a couple of years ago. Yeah.
Doesn't the answer not make sense to the question? Because wouldn't the question be different if you wanted it to like make sense?
Okay. How so? Like, what do you?
Have you ever like been denied? Like, it's like, yeah, for another example, have you ever like, have you ever had someone slap you with basically, like,
Right.
yeah, it's just
Right.
like,
The
what-
answer set doesn't match. Yeah, please.
I feel like it should be like a yes or no question, because it's like when you say denied, it's like, has this happened to you or has it not happened to you? You can't simply just agree or disagree. I feel like there's no like,
So the set of possible answers doesn't match the question.
yeah.
Okay.
I was gonna say the same thing, that it's phrased as a yes or no question.
Okay. Someone actually did submit this to me. It was not pretty. Yeah, please. And then Lila.
It also, like, not the biggest problem with it, but like, it's very, like, definitive, like, have you been denied a job, right? Like, cause usually when you don't get a call back, they don't say, they don't send you an email like, we didn't call you back and here's why, you
Right.
know?
Is it
So
even
it's-
something that someone could know, right?
Totally, it's a little bit like speculative, you know, so unless they're giving you a survey that says like, have you been convicted of a criminal offense, which like a lot of jobs do, right? Like,
Yeah.
check the box, but they never really give you the feedback as to like.
Did that stop you
that
from
was the
getting?
reason.
Right. You might have just not been a good fit, right? Yeah, Lila.
Yeah, I was just gonna say it's double-barreled because job opportunity and promotion are two different things.
Yeah, that's true as well, right? A job opportunity or promotion. And then again, like for either one, how would you know? Is there a way to kind of fix this question?
You could say, have you ever been denied a job opportunity? Yes or no?
Okay.
Due to criminal convictions, yes or no? And then, or do not answer.
Okay.
I
Interesting.
think by making it single and only asking one thing, it kind of takes away that double barrel aspect a little bit.
Okay. That's possible. I mean, it still gets into the problem. I'm sorry, I don't remember your name.
Me?
Yes.
Caitlin.
Caitlin. What Caitlin was saying, that, basically, how would someone know, right, whether they've been denied a job or promotion based on a criminal conviction? Because, yeah, potential employers are unlikely to tell you, yeah.
If you want to maintain like the Likert scale, you could take it more like qualitatively, like on how likely do you feel that a job has rejected you based on like a criminal conviction if you've already established that.
Okay, that's an interesting one. Like, you could ask their opinion whether they think they've been denied, and you probably should split job opportunity or promotion into two questions, but do you think you've been denied job opportunities because of your, like, I guess you would phrase it, I believe, because you want statements with this kind of Likert scale, I believe I've been denied job opportunities because of my criminal conviction, and then strongly agree to strongly disagree. And now you're in the territory, you get away from the problem that Caitlin pointed out, where you can't know if an employer denied you for that, but I know what I think, right? I think I was denied that job opportunity because of my criminal conviction. So you can know what you think, right? You can know your own opinion, and you can know how strongly you agree with it or not. I think that's, oh, yes, I have one more. I believe the Prime Minister is a competent and charismatic leader. Strongly agree, neither agree nor disagree, or strongly disagree. What, if anything, is wrong with this question?
Competent and charismatic should be two different questions.
Right, again, we're talking about a double-barreled question. I thought about putting in, like, good looking as well, to make it a triple-barreled question, right? I could say, I believe the Prime Minister is a competent, charismatic, good looking leader. I can't think of any other adjectives to talk about Justin Trudeau. I don't know why. He's fine. I just like to rag on him because he has hair and I don't, right? At the end of the day.
It's a leading question. It should just ask, what do you think about our Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau?
I mean, you could ask if, person's level of agreement with, say, someone's competence, right? I believe that the prime minister is competent, right? You could ask that question. There's nothing inherently leading about that. I mean, okay, so here, it would be leading if you said something like, I believe Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who accepted a holiday in Jamaica from campaign donors, is corrupt, right? That would be more of a leading question. I'm not saying he is. I'm just using it as an example. Or I believe Donald Trump, who faces 94, is it 94? 93? I don't remember. It's in the 90s. Criminal indictments, is, unfit to be president, right? That's more of like a leading question, because like it's the commentary that you insert into the question there that is obviously going to be like, oh yeah, of course he's who's facing 93 criminal indictments could be could be president, right? Could be fit to be president. That doesn't seem possible, right? Same thing with I believe Joe Biden, who shows obvious signs of dementia, is fit to be president, right? You're leading people to a particular answer. Yeah, please.
I think that, for competent, that is a pretty simple, I agree, I disagree. As far as, charisma is concerned, though, that's sort of a little more, subjective.
Sure.
Right? And so it does kind of have that, positive connotation almost, because, some people could say, Hitler was really charismatic, but,
I hadn't thought of that. That's an interesting one.
If you're checking the box that says, yes, I believe Hitler's charismatic, you, feel like a bad person about it, right?
Okay.
Whether or not, they did good or bad things, right, is sort of irrelevant to whether or not they have charisma, but it still feels like a really, personal judgment.
Right. Yeah, that's a fair criticism. I was just trying to think of two things I could say about Justin Trudeau, other than he has nice hair. Or he used to. Actually, I don't think his hair is as nice as it used to be. It was nicer when he became prime minister. Now it seems kind of average. Sorry, my commentary on Justin Trudeau. Okay, why don't we're at 3:15. You did good work today. You criticized my badly written questions very competently. You've seen some things not to do. Why don't we leave it 5 minutes early for today? We'll finish up talking about, we're way ahead of the game right now anyway. We'll finish talking about survey design on Monday. And we'll keep barreling through the content till we get through qualitative research. And it should be a good time. Alrighty. Okay, we'll see you on Monday. If at any point you have any questions about assignments or feedback, your research question, you want to run it by me, you want to redo it, do shoot me an email. Friday I'm in the office after 1 o'clock. Just send me an email telling me you want to come by, and I'm happy to meet with you. So we will see you on Monday. Otherwise, have a great weekend, I guess. Thanks for all of your commentary. It's really, the participation helps and the questions really help. Hi. Of course.
Is it online?
So it's done, so yes and no.